Live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to This Week at Work, where we bring you the latest trending news on organizations, technology, and the future of work. I'm Matt Burns.
And I'm Chris Rainey. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. How you doing, Matt? How's your week been?
I'm doing really well. It's been a long week, but I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm good. As you can see, I'm in shorts and t-shirt today because it's the one day of the year we have some type of heat. So it's the only time. But you know what's the crazy thing? It's like 28 or not 20. Is it 30 over 30 today, Bruno? What is it? 32?
Yeah, 32.
32, and we're all in shorts and t-shirt. And tomorrow it's going to be raining. So it's like you can't win in the UK as well. So yeah, just pretty hot today. Studios, we don't have air conditioning in the UK. That's something that people don't realize. So we're just suffering. So we complain when it's cold. We complain when it's hot. That's just people in the UK.
You complain when it's wet.
We complain. No, you know what? I don't mind that. Oh, tomorrow, my name is Chris Rainey, so I kind of have no choice but to embrace the rain. But yeah, I can't complain though, because whenever I talk to you, it's either really hot where you are or you're snowed in and you can't leave the house. So we're okay. Anyway, so what we're talking about today, Matt? What's happening?
Something on this side of the pond I think might be interesting to chat about. Did you read the article about the legislation the government of Ontario introduced about the right to disconnect?
I did read it, and I think one of the takeaways I got that it was very vague.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's part of the issue.
The spirit of it is great. I mean, I think especially during the pandemic, I'm sure you heard, Chris, I heard lots of people talking about how the workday just kind of blended in with their personal lives.
Yes.
And how people actually worked longer hours during the pandemic, despite the fact that they weren't commuting to and from work. So I think the spirit of the legislation makes a ton of sense, giving people the ability to set some boundaries for their non-work hours.
Yeah. Who does it apply to then?
Everyone. They're talking about this to be every employee in an organization,
does it matter
including
size?
Managers and executives.
Okay. So does it matter about size?
25 employees and above is my understanding.
Okay.
But that encompasses a lot of organizations and puts in place the requirement for those organizations to clearly list policy and practice that's going to provide for the employees to disconnect during their work hours. But Chris, I'm sure you can imagine it prompts a lot of questions, especially for companies that are working in multiple time zones or organizations that may have
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because it's all well and good saying that any work-related communications, emails, telephone calls, videos, Slack, etc. But then how do you do that when you're a company that has a global workforce?
So what I've seen up to this point, and this is for organizations that even weren't looking at this legislation, but just simply created right to disconnect policies during the pandemic, they found windows of time during the workday where it was agreed upon that everyone would be available. So in a situation where, for example, there's a 3-hour spread between time zones, they might carve out like noon to 4 p.m. time at the head office, which would afford people working an hour before or an hour after the ability to contribute, but also not encroach upon their personal time.
Mm-hmm. And does this also, I'm assuming is it only for full-time employees? Is it part-time as well?
The way the legislation is written, it feels very corporate office driven.
Okay.
So it feels a lot like individuals in that sense. I wonder how it's going to apply to individuals in, for example, customer service roles or hospitality roles, where they may have a requirement to be in the workplace throughout the day. But I also think that those organizations and those employees are likely not communicating as much during the off hours as you would see in a typical professional services environment.
Yeah. So is companies have to do this? Is it going to be regulated?
It's in Ontario, it's regulated, and then it's being looked at across Canada as being rolled out. Now, this isn't the first jurisdiction that's done this, Chris. I think France has similar legislation already, and it's certainly being talked about throughout the EU. So I think it's an interesting concept as organizations consider how they find that work-life balance for their employees and give them assurances that remote work doesn't just equate to more working hours.
Yeah. What's the what's the downside of, or say what's the, would they get a slap on the wrist if they don't do this? Have they kind of said what
Yeah.
the ramifications will be?
That part's not clear. And I
Yeah.
also wonder how they're going to enforce it for managers and executives because traditionally there's like a wink, wink, nudge,
Yes,
nudge.
what I
Like
mean.
those, yeah,
Yeah.
like in Canada specifically, and in the US for that matter, I'm sure it's the similar in the EU. Managers don't qualify for overtime, for example. So all hours are considered salaried. Salaried hours don't factor into overtime calculations, and many managers and leaders end up working well beyond the hours of work. Now, in saying that, the legislation is meant to cover all those individuals and afford the opportunity to have those conversations. I think you're right. Enforcement and details around that are limited, and how they'll treat situations where there is a lack of a policy, or worse, if there's a policy and organizations aren't honoring that policy. I'll be interested to see how that plays out in the coming months.
Yeah. How have you already seen any examples of how HR leaders are rolling this out? Any advice of how they should do that?
Yeah, I've seen examples of, again, understanding the environments in which we're operating in. So if you're operating in a workplace that has multiple time zones, accounting for that when figuring out the hours of work. And I think it's wise to determine, call it office hours, call it connected hours, but there's a period of time throughout the workday where people are expected to be on Slack, on their emails, available for phone calls, and be able to participate in company-wide meetings, conversations, huddles, things of that nature. I also think it's really important that organizations factor in types of employment that might require exceptions. So, Chris, I know you and I have been talking lately offline about IT issues
Yeah.
and technical issues.
Yeah.
Well, for organizations that employ IT staff that may have to jump on the line and be available outside traditional working hours to resolve potentially an IT ticket or a service ticket, you have to account for situations like that where there might be people who are required to be on call, and then how do you reflect that in the policy, and how do you compensate employees for that, understanding you're asking more from them than you are from others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's also a good opportunity for HR and the business to emphasize well-being and people taking
Mm.
care of themselves as well. So I do think it's a strong narrative and very important. I'm just, whenever we see these things rolled out, it's very grey.
Always.
Even from reading the article, it doesn't say a lot. I was looking at what the ramifications and violations could be, and there isn't any kind of. It just says that these complaints could be taken to the Ministry of Labour. That's it. It's like,
Mm.
well, so I'm wondering how many companies are going to take this serious um, as well.
So I think the bigger signal is, now that it's legislation, there's an expectation that employees will be aware of this and be able to hold their employers
Accountable,
accountable.
exactly. Okay.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
so I think you're right. I think I would be. I don't think we're going to envision a place where we're going to see people being imprisoned or large fines for this. Most things involving labor legislation, transgressions are quite modest. Like, it's more of a shaming that actually is the punishment, as opposed to anything financial or punitive in that sense. I think you'll see something similar evolve here, where there'll be an expectation this is now a standard. And in an environment, Chris, I mean, step away from this legislation, the global workforce is shrinking. And the great resignation, although it occurred before the pandemic, the trend continued throughout the pandemic, and more people are leaving their organizations than ever before, particularly people that are most likely to be impacted by this legislation. So if I'm an organization and I have legislation, I'm intended to have legislation in place that enforces wellness and work-life balance. If I don't honor that, I run the risk of continuing to lose people that I would rather not, and have a more difficult time attracting people that I would otherwise be able to get.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there is a lack of teeth around enforcement, but I think enforcement will be more implicit. And ultimately, if organizations hope to compete, they're going to have to comply.
Yeah. Do you think this should be applicable across the world? Like in
It's a tough question, and it's challenging for organizations that have a wider spread of those hours. So I think about companies that don't just have a 3-hour time difference, but may have operations across, to your point, the entire world. And how do you work when you have offices in London and New York and Mumbai, for example? Because finding 4 hours throughout the day where you all can get together is
Yeah.
going to put somebody outside the traditional working hours. So I think that's a challenge in and of itself. I also think that there is there will be sentiment around we're coming out of a pandemic. In many cases, people are talking about we're going into a recession. Is this the right time to introduce legislation that makes organizations less competitive? Now, I don't view it in that lens, but I feel like that's going to be a narrative that spins up off of this, or as this idea is introduced or talked about in other jurisdictions. That might be one of the concerns that's raised is now is the time actually to double down and work harder, which would run against what we just talked about, how in the pandemic people actually worked more hours. But the perception might be that organizations are trying to recoup some of the lost potential during the pandemic. Now isn't the time to swing the pendulum back towards employee wellness, but rather to actually double down, work harder, contribute more. I think that's short-term thinking. I think we need to play the longer game here. And I think in light of the aforementioned global constraint around skilled resources in a knowledge-based economy, we have to look at the bigger picture and ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve as an organization? And are we looking for the best possible talent? Or are we looking for a carousel of people to come in and out of the organization?
It's interesting because we spoke last week about Elon Musk saying everyone needs to come back into the workplace, and for their type of industry and organization where Tesla's just on a rocket, literally on a rocket ship, because they also own SpaceX and growing so quickly, they can actually say, well, this is, be super transparent. This is who we are. This is what it means to work at Tesla. You either like it or you don't. You stay or you leave. But then they also get, shares and compensate accordingly. So people will forego perhaps that work-life balance. But, again, so if this comes into legislation, I can't imagine how a company like Tesla would fit into something like this as well. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, industry, company. There's no kind of one-size-fits-all. So it's an interesting topic.
And in the US in particular, it's always challenging because their labor laws tend to be a bit more conservative than what we find in the UK and in Canada. And legislation will generally pop up at a state-by-state basis. And I would imagine that if situations where legislation like this is introduced, organizations might actually move their corporate offices from one state to another. Yeah.
Wow.
In the same way they moved for taxation purposes and have a lot of businesses that are based in Ireland, right? Like there's a lot of organizations will do what organizations will do in order to avoid some of these rules. And it could create inequities when you look at certain jurisdictions. So that being said, I think this conversation around competitiveness and wellness and finding the balance is a really important conversation. So for HR leaders that are asking themselves, does this affect me? And how should this look? And should we draw inspiration from this? Finding that sweet spot between being competitive, but also driving a wellness mandate, I think is absolutely essential in a knowledge-based economy. Because Chris, we've talked about this before, there's a clear link scientifically between intrinsic motivation, that is the motivation that comes from within. It can't be compelled. It's not carrot. It's not stick. It's the motivation that you drive for yourself. Intrinsic motivation, discretionary effort, that is the effort that you contribute beyond what is absolutely possible or absolutely required, that mean, and then organizational performance. So in a knowledge-based economy where you don't prioritize wellness, it would stand to reason that performance might drop over time. And that in and of itself, whether it's presenteeism, whether it's declining disengagement, whether it's higher attrition, that in and of itself has many hidden costs to an organization that frankly can't be measured at this point in time.
Definitely. I think that's pretty much everything, Matt, for that. Unless we've missed anything.
I mean, you got your shorts on. I feel like you need to go to the beach right now. It's 30 degrees. I think this is a good spot to wrap.
One thing I do want to say for everyone listening, we're going to launch our newsletter soon. So look out for that. It's going to be coming from Matt. So just check your inbox. There'll be a This Week newsletter. So if you can't catch the live show, you'll be able to watch it on demand there. And we'll be updating that every single week. So make sure you look out for that when Matt drops that. But apart from that,
I'd love to hear, Chris, too. We've been talking about this offline, you and I. what would people like in terms of the ideal length of this show? We've
Yeah,
tried
it's true.
30 minutes,
20 minutes, half an hour,
a little bit,
40.
20 minutes, 15 minutes. I'd love to hear from people. What is their ideal length for a weekly show like this? We're happy to go the full 30 minutes if that's what people are looking for. But I also understand in today's TikTok era where everything's coming in 60-second increments, people may want something a little bit shorter. So if you could let us know in the comment section your ideal length for a show like this, that would really help us drive the path going forward.
Also, we need to figure out a good way of like people submitting topics as well. Whether that's like an email or we do a poll, any ideas, let us know. I think it'd be cool, right? Just to react live and let the audience choose.
I think people might have a perception that we actually prepare for these conversations
no.
when in reality we don't. So they can just throw topics at us
100%.
We would probably be able to do that.
No, yeah, exactly. There you go. Let's do that. Well, okay. Well, apart from that, everyone, have a good weekend and enjoy the sun. Hopefully you got sun wherever you are, and we'll see you next week. See you later, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.